The Taliban fighters surged from the ravine like a swarm of hornets, their AK-47s chattering in the thin mountain air. Corporal Emily Carter pressed herself against the rocky outcrop, her medical pack digging into her spine as rounds splintered the stone inches from her head. Dust and fragments stung her face. She could taste copper and grit on her tongue. "Medic! Carter, we need you." Lance Corporal Rodriguez's voice cracked through the chaos. High and desperate, preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not today. The patrol through the Korengal Valley was meant to be routine, a show of force. A few handshakes with village elders, then back to Phobe Phoenix before sunset. Instead, they'd walked straight into a coordinated ambush. 3 sides. Maybe 40 fighters. The Marines of Second Platoon, Golf Company, were pinned down in a kill zone with nowhere to run. She risked a glance around the boulder. Rodriguez was 30 meters away, dragging Private First Class Mendez behind a disabled Humvee. Blood soaked Mendez's trouser leg, pooling in the Afghan dirt. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. "I'm coming," Emily shouted, though she doubted Rodriguez heard her over the gunfire. She grabbed her aid bag and prepared to sprint. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to wait for the shooting to stop, to let someone else handle it. But that wasn't what she'd signed up for. When she raised her right hand and swore that oath, she'd promised to go where others couldn't, to run toward the sound of gunfire when everyone else ran away. Emily sucked in a breath of acrid, smoke-filled air and bolted from cover. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Her boots pounded against loose shale. Tracers streaked past like angry fireflies. She heard someone screaming, maybe her, maybe Rodriguez, maybe the mountain itself. 20 meters, 15. A bullet kicked up dirt at her feet. 10 meters. She dove behind the Humvee and slammed into the armored door hard enough to rattle her teeth. "Jesus, Doc, you're crazy." Rodriguez's eyes were wide, his hands pressed against Mendez's thigh. Slick with blood, Emily's training kicked in, pushing aside the fear. She yanked open her bag and pulled out a tourniquet. "Move your hands now." Rodriguez complied. The wound was bad arterial bleed, high on the femoral. Mendez had maybe minutes if she didn't stop it. She wound the tourniquet above the injury and twisted the windlass, counting rotations. 1, 2, 3. The bleeding slowed to a trickle. "Stay with me, Mendez," she said, checking his pulse. Thready but present. "You're going to be fine. You're going to tell your kids about this someday." Mendez tried to smile but managed only a grimace. "Kids? Gonna think I'm full of shit. Probably," Emily agreed, packing the wound with gauze. "But you'll have scars to prove it." A thunderous explosion shook the earth. The disabled Humvee rocked on its axles. Emily's ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. She looked up to see a plume of black smoke rising from the ridgeline where Staff Sergeant Morrison had set up the squad automatic weapon. The saw had gone silent. That's when she heard it, a voice cutting through the ringing, calm and authoritative, despite the hell erupting around them. "Carter, I need you up here." Emily's blood went cold. That was Gunnery Sergeant James "Gunny" Hatcher, the platoon's second in command. A man who'd served 3 tours in Fallujah and had the scars and decorations to prove he was damn near invincible. If Gunny needed her, someone was hurt bad. She finished securing Mendez's bandage and looked at Rodriguez. "Keep pressure on this. Don't let him go into shock. Talk to him. Keep him warm." "Where are you?" But Emily was already moving, scrambling up the rocky slope toward Gunny's position. Her lungs burned. The thin air at 8,000 feet made every breath feel like sucking through a straw. Sweat poured down her back despite the October chill. she found Gunny behind a cluster of boulders, cradling Lieutenant Marcus Webb in his arms. The lieutenant's face was ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid. A jagged piece of shrapnel protruded from his lower abdomen, just above the hip. Blood seeped around the edges, dark and ominous. "Frag from an RPG," Gunny said, his usual gruff demeanor cracking. He took it, trying to get Morrison back. Emily knelt beside them, her hands already assessing the wound. This was bad. Worse than Mendez. The shrapnel had likely nicked the iliac artery or worse. If she pulled it out, he'd bleed out in seconds. If she left it in... "I need a 9-line, she said, referring to the medical evacuation request. "Now, radio's out," Gunny replied. RPG took out our primary, and the backups with Sergeant Chun on the North Ridge. Emily's mind raced. No radio meant no medevac. No medevac meant Lieutenant Webb would die right here in the dirt unless she could stabilize him long enough to carry him down the mountain. And even then, with Taliban fighters controlling the high ground, their chances of making it to the landing zone were slim to none. "Put pressure here," she instructed Gunny, guiding his hands. "Don't touch the shrapnel. If it shifts, he's gone." She reached into her bag for 4 supplies. Webb's veins were already collapsing from blood loss and shock. It took her 3 tries to get the catheter in, and even then, she wasn't sure how much good the saline would do. He needed a surgeon, a hospital, maybe a miracle. How bad? Webb whispered, his eyes finding hers. Emily forced a smile she didn't feel. "You'll be playing golf again in no time, sir. Liar. But he tried to smile back. The gunfire intensified. Emily could hear Sergeant Chen's voice from the northern position, barking orders, directing fire. The Marines were giving as good as they got, but they were outnumbered and running low on ammunition. This wasn't a fight they could win, it was a fight they had to survive. Gunny's radio crackled to life, Chun's voice distorted by static. Massive push. Eastern slope. They single quote retrying to. The transmission cut out. Emily looked at Gunny. His jaw was set, his eyes hard. She'd seen that expression before, on the faces of men who knew they were about to do something desperate. "Carter," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. That eastern slope? That's our only way out. If they take it, we're surrounded. We'll all die up here. What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone needs to hold that line." He paused, meeting her eyes. "And every Marine who can still fight is already engaged. Except you." Emily Carter had never planned to become a combat medic. Growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, she dreamed of medical school, of white coats and sterile hospitals, of saving lives in controlled environments where everything made sense. But dreams cost money, and the Carter family had never had much of that. Her father, Robert Carter, had worked at the John Deere plant for 30 years, his hands permanently stained with grease, his back bent from decades of repetitive motion. Her mother, Sarah, cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the east side of town, coming home each evening with stories about marble countertops and wine cellars that cost more than the Carters' entire house. Emily was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother Michael had joined the army straight out of high school and was currently stationed in Germany, sending home photos of himself drinking beer in Munich and hiking in the Alps. Her sister Jennifer had married her high school sweetheart and produced 2 kids before she turned 25, settling into a life that looked comfortable, but somehow hollow to Emily's eyes. At 17, sitting in her guidance counselor's office, Emily had done the math. 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, residency. By the time she'd be earning a real doctor's salary, she'd be drowning in debt until she was 40. The counselor, Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman with reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose, had suggested alternatives. "Have you considered the military?" she'd asked. "They have excellent health care programs, education benefits, You could serve for a few years, then use the GI Bill for medical school. The idea had seemed absurd at first. Emily was 5'5", weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet, and had never fired a gun in her life. But the more she researched, the more sense it made. The Navy had corpsmen who served with the Marines. Real medical training. Combat experience that would make her a better doctor. And when her service was done, Uncle Sam would pay for medical school. She'd signed the papers 3 days after her 18th birthday. Much to her mother's horror and her father's quiet pride. Boot camp at Paris Island had been 12 weeks of hell. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Angela Reeves had seemed to take particular pleasure in making Emily's life miserable. 5 a.m. wake-ups. 20-mile forced march with 60-pound packs. Obstacle courses that left her muscles screaming. Combat drills in the South Carolina heat until she thought she might actually die. But Emily had survived. More than that, she'd excelled. She discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to push past pain, past exhaustion, past the voice in her head that begged her to quit. She learned that her body could endure far more than her mind believed possible. Field Medical Training School at Camp Lejeune had been different. The physical demands were still intense, but now Emily was learning things that actually mattered: anatomy, physiology, triage, how to stop arterial bleeding with a tourniquet, how to establish an airway in a patient with a crushed trachea, how to recognize and treat traumatic brain injuries, tension pneumothorax, hypovolemic shock. The instructors were former corpsmen who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan. They told stories that made Emily's blood run cold. Firefights in Fallujah, where they'd treated Marines under heavy fire. IED strikes that turned Humvees into death traps. Mass casualty events, where they'd had to decide who lived and who died based on nothing but their training and instinct. Chief, Petty Officer Marcus Blackwell, a grizzled veteran with a prosthetic left hand, had pulled Emily aside after class one day. "You're good, Carter," he'd said. "Quick hands. Steady under pressure. But you need to understand something. Everything you're learning here, it's all theoretical until the first time you're kneeling in the dirt with someone's blood on your hands, listening to them beg you to save their life. That's when you'll find out what you're really made of." Emily had nodded, not fully understanding. Not yet. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan's Helmand Province, attached to 1st Battalion, 6th Marines. She'd arrived at FOB Leatherneck in March, when the weather was still cool and the poppy fields were blooming with obscene beauty. The base was a sprawling complex of concrete barriers, plywood barracks, and endless concertina wire. The air always smelled of diesel fuel and burning trash. She'd been assigned to Second Platoon. Golf Company, under the command of Lieutenant Webb. Webb was 24. Fresh from the basic school at Quantico, with the kind of baby face that made him look like he should still be in college rather than leading 40 Marines in combat. But there was steel beneath that youthful exterior. Emily had seen it in their first briefing, when Webb had outlined the platoon's mission with calm precision. "Our area of operations is the Korengal Valley," he'd said, pointing to a map that showed nothing but mountains and rivers. "The local population is approximately 3,000 Pashtun villagers spread across maybe 20 settlements. They don't like us, they don't like the Afghan government, and they especially don't like anyone who isn't from their valley. The Taliban has deep roots here. We're going to change that." Gunnery Sergeant Hatcher, the platoon sergeant, had snorted. "Good luck, sir. The Russians tried that for 10 years. So did we back in 06 through 10. Valley's got a nickname, the Valley of Death. Guess why?" But Webb hadn't been deterred. He'd spent hours studying the area, learning the names of village elders, understanding the tribal dynamics, planning patrols that would show force without being unnecessarily aggressive. Emily had admired his dedication, even if she thought he was naive. The first 2 months had been relatively quiet. Patrols through villages where children begged for candy and old men watched with hostile eyes. Hours of guard duty staring at mountains that all looked the same. Training exercises where they practiced immediate action drills and medevac procedures. Emily had treated plenty of injuries, blisters, heat exhaustion. One memorable case of a Marine who'd somehow managed to accidentally stab himself with his own knife, but nothing serious. She'd gotten to know her platoon. There was Sergeant David Chen, the squad leader from San Francisco, who'd been studying to be an engineer before 9/11s changed everything. He had a wife and infant daughter back home, and he carried their photo everywhere, showing it to anyone who'd look. Lance Corporal Tommy Rodriguez was 19, from El Paso, full of swagger and bad jokes. He talked constantly about his girlfriend Maria, about how they were going to get married as soon as he got home, about the restaurant they'd opened together. Private First Class James Mendez was the baby of the platoon at 18. Fresh from School of Infantry, eager to prove himself. He'd joined because his older brother had been killed in Iraq, and he wanted to honor that sacrifice. Staff Sergeant David Morrison was the weapons squad leader, a taciturn man from Montana who'd rather clean his M249 saw than talk to people. But Emily had seen him with the younger Marines, teaching them with infinite patience, and she knew there was more to him than the gruff exterior. And then there was Gunnery Hatcher, 38 years old, on his 4th deployment, with a wife and 3 kids back in Oceanside. He ran the platoon with an iron fist and a sharp sense of humor. He was the man who made sure Marines ate, slept, and stayed sharp. He was also the man who'd sat with Emily during her 2nd week when she'd been feeling overwhelmed. "It's a lot, isn't it?" he'd said, sitting beside her outside the aid station. "Being responsible for everyone's life." "I don't know if I can do it," Emily had admitted. "What if I mess up? What if someone dies because I wasn't good enough?" Gunny had been quiet for a moment, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You know what the difference is between a good corpsman and a great one? It's not the medical knowledge. You all learn the same stuff. It's whether you can keep your head when everything's falling apart. Whether you can make decisions when there's no good options. Whether you can live with those decisions afterward. How do you know if you have that? You don't, not until it happens." He'd stood, dusting off his trousers. "But I'll tell you what I tell every Marine who comes through here. We don't train you to be perfect. We train you to be good enough to survive. The rest? That comes from being here, doing the work, learning from your mistakes. And Carter, you're going to make mistakes. We all do. The trick is making sure they're not fatal." Those words had stayed with Emily through the following weeks. She'd thrown herself into her work, studying field medicine manuals by flashlight, practicing her skills on training dummies until her hands moved with muscle memory, getting to know every Marine's medical history so she'd be prepared for anything. She'd also started going on more patrols, despite it not being strictly necessary. Corpsmen were valuable assets, usually kept relatively safe at the FOB. But Emily wanted to understand the environment, to know the terrain, to be familiar with the villages and the people. And if she was being honest, she wanted to prove herself, to show that she belonged here, that she wasn't just some scared kid playing medic. Lieutenant Webb had approved her requests, though Gunny had grumbled about it. "You're not a rifleman, Doc," he'd said. "Your job is to keep yourself alive so you can patch up the idiots who get shot. Hard to do that if you catch a bullet yourself." "I'll be careful," Emily had promised. Famous last words, Gunny had muttered, but he'd let her go. Emily's first real test had come in late April. During a patrol through the village of Candelay, they'd been walking through the narrow streets, weapons ready but not raised, trying to project strength without aggression. The villagers had watched from doorways, their expressions unreadable. Private First Class Jackson, a Marine from Tennessee with a thick accent and an unfortunate tendency to speak before thinking, had been walking point. Emily had been in the middle of the patrol column, her aid bag bouncing against her back with each step. The IED had been buried in the road, probably triggered by a spotter watching from the hills. One moment Jackson was there, joking about the smell of goat dung. The next moment there was a flash of light and a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Emily's ears had rung. Dust filled the air, making it hard to see. She'd heard screaming, high-pitched, agonized. Her training had kicked in before conscious thought. She'd run toward the blast site, her hands already reaching for her aid bag. Jackson was down, his left leg a mangled ruin below the knee. The explosion had severed his foot completely. Blood pumped from the stump in rhythmic spurts. Emily had dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Tourniquet from the bag. Position it high on the thigh, above the knee. Wean to windlass. 1 rotation. 2, 3, 4, 5. The bleeding slowed, stopped. Corpsman up. Someone had been shouting, but Emily was already there. Jackson's eyes had been wild with shock and pain. My foot! Where's my foot? It's gone, Emily had said, forcing herself to sound calm. But you're going to be okay. I need you to stay with me, Jackson. Keep breathing. You're going to make it. She'd established in 4-line, pumping him full of saline and morphine. She'd packed the wound with quick-clot gauze to control any residual bleeding. She'd monitored his vitals, watching for signs of shock. The medevac helicopter had arrived within 20 minutes, a lifetime, when you're kneeling beside a wounded Marine. The flight medics had loaded Jackson onto a stretcher, given Emily an approving nod, and lifted off in a storm of dust and rotor wash. Lieutenant Webb had approached her afterward, as the patrol regrouped. Good work, Carter. You saved his life. Emily had looked down at her hands, still sticky with Jackson's blood. Will he be okay? He's alive. That's because of you. Webb had paused. How are you holding up? I'm fine, sir. You sure? First time seeing something like that can be. I said I'm fine. The words had come out sharper than intended. Webb had studied her for a moment, then nodded. Okay, but if you need to talk, my door's open. Or Gunny's, or the Chaplain's. Don't bottle it up. But Emily had bottled it up. That night, alone in her rack, she'd stared at the plywood ceiling and tried not to think about Jackson's screams. About the wet sound his blood had made hitting the dirt. About how close she'd come to losing him. She'd tried not to think about how many more times she'd have to do this over the next 7 months. She'd tried not to think about Chief Blackwell's words. That's when you'll find out what you're really made of. Instead, she'd gotten up, pulled out her field manual, and studied the section on blast injuries until her eyes burned with exhaustion. The patrols continued. More villages, more suspicious glances, more tension that felt like a rubber band being stretched to its breaking point. The platoon had a few more contacts, sporadic gunfire from distant ridgelines, the occasional rocket-propelled grenade that exploded harmlessly in an empty field. Nobody got hurt. Emily treated the usual complaints. Stomach bugs from drinking water that hadn't been properly purified. Infected blisters from boots that didn't fit quite right. One memorable case where Lance Corporal Rodriguez had somehow gotten a scorpion sting on his ass. Don't ask, Rodriguez had said, wincing as Emily applied anti-inflammatory cream. Just don't ask. Wasn't going to, Emily had replied, fighting back a smile. Life at Phobe Phoenix had settled into a rhythm. Wake at dawn. Pete to physical training that left everyone sweating and cursing. Breakfast in the chow hall, where the powdered eggs tasted like cardboard and the coffee could strip paint. Morning briefings where Lieutenant Webb outlined the day's patrol routes. Patrols that lasted anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. Evenings spent maintaining equipment, writing letters home, or playing cards in the rec tent. Emily had written to her parents weekly, carefully editing out anything that might worry them. She told them about the mountains, about the children who smiled when the Marines handed out school supplies. About the weird food at the FOB. She didn't tell them about the IEDs, the firefights. The constant low level fear that had become as familiar as breathing. Her mother's letters back were filled with news from Cedar Rapids. Jennifer's kids were doing well in school. Michael had gotten engaged to a German woman named Greta. The John Deere plant was laying people off. Dad's back was acting up again. Her father's letters were shorter, less frequent, but they always ended the same way: stay safe. We're proud of you. Emily kept those letters in her footlocker, reading them when the nights felt too long and the weight of responsibility too heavy. In June, the tempo of operations had increased. Intelligence suggested the Taliban was planning a major offensive before the summer fighting season ended. More patrols, longer hours, less sleep. The platoon was running on caffeine and adrenaline. Lieutenant Webb had pushed himself hardest of all. He'd lost weight, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. Dark circles had formed under his eyes. But he never complained, never asked his Marines to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Gunny had pulled him aside one evening, and Emily had overheard their conversation. "Sir, you need to take a break. You're running yourself into the ground." "We all are, Gunny. With respect, sir, we need you sharp. Can't lead if you're too exhausted to think straight." Webb had sighed. "I know, I just ... I keep thinking about Jackson. About how I should have seen that IED. Should have been more careful. That IED was buried deep and well hidden. Wasn't your fault. Doesn't feel that way." Emily had understood. She'd felt the same way after every injury, every close call. The guilt of wondering if there was something more she could have done, something she'd missed, but there was no time for guilt. The mission continued. On a scorching day in early July, Second Platoon had conducted a patrol to the village of Aranas, nestled in a narrow valley between two ridgelines. The village elder, a man named Haji Zaman, had requested a meeting to discuss security concerns. Lieutenant Webb had seen it as an opportunity to build trust, to show the villagers that the Marines were there to help. Gunny had been skeptical. "Could be a setup, sir. Could be. But we can't build relationships if we don't take some risks." They'd brought a full squad, 13 Marines plus Emily. They'd approached the village cautiously, watching for signs of ambush. But the meeting had gone smoothly. Haji Zaman had complained about Taliban fighters demanding food and shelter, about the Afghan government's corruption, about roads that needed repair and schools that needed supplies. Lieutenant Webb had listened patiently, taking notes, promising to bring the concerns to the provincial reconstruction team. Emily had distributed medical supplies to the village's makeshift clinic, showing the local health worker how to properly dress wounds and dispense antibiotics. Children had swarmed around the Marines, their hands outstretched. Rodriguez had distributed candy from his pack, laughing as the kids fought over the brightly colored wrappers. "See?" Webb had said quietly to Gunny as they'd prepared to leave. "Not everyone's the enemy." "Yet," Gunny had replied. The walk back to the FOB had been uneventful. The sun had beaten down mercilessly, turning the patrol into a slow march through an oven. Emily's uniform had been soaked with sweat. Her feet had ached, but she'd felt good. They'd accomplished something positive, made a connection. That night, lying in her rack, Emily had allowed herself to think that maybe this deployment wouldn't be so bad. Maybe they could actually make a difference here. Maybe she'd go home in one piece, use her GI Bill, become a doctor, and look back on this as a formative experience rather than a traumatic one. She'd been naive. The ambush came 2 weeks later, on what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the Korengal Valley. Lieutenant Webb had wanted to check on several villages, assess the security situation, maybe distribute some humanitarian aid. Nothing special. Nothing that should have gone wrong. But everything had gone wrong. Now Emily was on a mountain in Afghanistan, with her lieutenant bleeding out beside her. Taliban fighters closing in from 3 sides. and Gunnery Sergeant Hatcher telling her she might have to pick up a weapon and fight. "I'm a medic," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the gunfire. "I'm not supposed to." "I know what you're supposed to do," Gunny interrupted. "But we're way past supposed to. We're in survival mode. And I need every hand on deck." He reached down to his belt and unholstered his sidearm, a Beretta M9 pistol. He held it out to her. Emily stared at the weapon. She'd qualified with the M9 in training, but she'd never fired one in combat. Never pointed a gun at another human being with the intention of killing them. "I can't," she whispered. "You can." Gunny's voice was firm, but not unkind. "And you will. Because if you don't, we all die up here. Including Lieutenant Webb." Emily looked down at Webb. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He needed surgery. He needed a hospital. But first, he needed to survive the next hour. She took the pistol. "Good," Gunny said. "Now listen to me. You're not going on offense. You're going to hold a position on that eastern slope and make sure nobody gets past you. Can you do that?" Emily's hand trembled as she gripped the M9. I think so. That's not good enough. I need to know you can do this." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant. I can do this. Outstanding." He pointed to a cluster of rocks about 50 meters to the east. "That's your position. You see anyone coming up that slope who's not wearing the Marine uniform, you shoot them. Understand?" "Yes, go, now." Emily looked at Webb one more time, then scrambled toward her assigned position. Her medical training screamed at her to stay with her patient, to monitor his vitals, to be ready if he crashed. But her training had also taught her about priorities. And right now, the priority was ensuring they all lived long enough for medevac to arrive if medevac could even get here. She reached the rock cluster and pressed herself against the stone, trying to make herself as small as possible. From this position, she had a clear view of the eastern slope. It was steep, covered in loose shale and scrub brush. Anyone trying to climb it would be exposed, vulnerable. She checked the M9. Full magazine. 1 in the chamber. 15 rounds total. Not much, but it would have to be enough. The firefight raged around her. She could hear Sergeant Chun's squad laying down suppressive fire on the northern ridge. Morrison's saw had fallen silent. She hoped he was alive, just out of ammunition or repositioning. The distinctive crack of a K-47S, mixed with the deeper boom of M4 rifles. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her hands shook. Her mouth was dry. She wanted to run, to hide, to be anywhere but here. But she stayed, because that's what Marines did. They stayed. They fought. They held the line when retreat was the easier option. She saw movement on the slope. 3 figures, maybe 100 meters away, scrambling upward. They wore the traditional Afghan clothing, pakal hats, earth-tone shalwar kameez. They carried a K-47S. Emily raised the M9, trying to steady her shaking hands. The figures were getting closer. 80 meters, 70. Her finger found the trigger. 60 meters. She couldn't do it. Couldn't pull the trigger. These were human beings, not targets on a range. They had families, lives, dreams. Just like her. 50 meters. But they were also trying to kill her friends. Trying to kill Lieutenant Webb, who'd taken shrapnel protecting his Marines. Trying to kill Rodriguez and Mendez and Gunny, and all the others who'd become her family. 40 meters. Emily thought about her father's letters. "Stay safe. We're proud of you." 30 meters. She thought about Chief Blackwell's words. "That's when you'll find out what you're really made of." 20 meters. She squeezed the trigger. The M9 kicked in her hand. The lead fighter dropped, clutching his shoulder. Not a kill shot, but he was down. The other 2 dove for cover behind rocks. Emily's hands steadied. Her breathing slowed. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Focus, determination, the knowledge that she would do whatever it took to protect her Marines. She fired again and again, keeping the fighters pinned down, preventing them from advancing. From somewhere to her left, she heard Gunny's voice. "That's it, Carter. Keep them suppressed." She wasn't a rifleman. She wasn't an infantryman. She was a medic, a healer, someone who'd taken an oath to preserve life. But today, on this mountain, she was also a Marine. And Marines adapted. They overcame. They survived. Emily Carter kept firing. The firefight lasted another 40 minutes, though to Emily it felt like hours. Her ears rang from the constant gunfire. Her hands ached from gripping the M9. She'd fired every round, then scavenged more ammunition from Lieutenant Webb's drop pouch when the Taliban fighters on the eastern slope attempted another push. She'd hit at least 2 more, though she couldn't tell if the wounds were fatal. Part of her hoped they weren't. Part of her didn't care. The contradiction twisted in her gut like broken glass. When the shooting finally stopped, it wasn't because Second Platoon had won. It was because 2 Fa-18 Hornets had screamed overhead, their jet engines announcing death from above. The Taliban fighters had scattered like cockroaches when someone flipped on a light, disappearing into caves and ravines where airstrikes couldn't reach them. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. Emily's hands trembled as she holstered the M9. Her uniform was soaked with a mixture of sweat, dirt, and blood, some of it hers from a fragment that had grazed her forearm, most of it from the wounded she'd treated. "Carter." Gunny's voice cut through her mental fog. "Webb's crashing." Training overrode emotion. Emily sprinted back to Lieutenant Webb's position, her medical bag bouncing against her spine. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already checking his pulse. Thready, weak, barely there. His skin had turned a sickly gray. His breathing came in shallow, irregular gasps. The shrapnel was still embedded in his abdomen, but blood was seeping around it, despite the pressure dressing she'd applied earlier. "I need that 9 line, Emily said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Now, working on it," Sergeant Chen replied. He was 30 meters away, shouting coordinates into the radio. The backup radio, the one that had survived the ambush. "Medevacs inbound. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Webb might not have 20 minutes. Emily pulled out her remaining 4 supplies. His veins were collapsed, making it nearly impossible to establish a line. She tried his left arm. No good. Right arm. Nothing. She palpated his neck, found the external jugular vein, and carefully inserted the catheter. "Stay with me, sir," she murmured as saline flowed into his bloodstream. "You're not dying on this mountain. I won't let you." Webb's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glassy with shock and pain. "Carter, the Marines, they're fine. Everyone's accounted for. Now shut up and save your strength." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Giving ... orders. To an officer ... Court-martial me later, sir." Gunny appeared beside her, his face grim. "Casualties?" Emily ran through her mental checklist. "Mendez is stable. Tourniquets holding. Morrison took shrapnel to his left shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. Rodriguez has some minor lacerations from rock fragments. 3 other Marines with superficial wounds. And Lieutenant Webb." She didn't need to finish that sentence. "Morrison saw?" Gunny asked. "Destroyed. RPG took it out in the first volley." Gunny cursed under his breath. "That's half our firepower gone. And we've still got to get down this mountain." Emily checked Webb's vitals again. Blood pressure dropping. Respiration shallow. She needed to do something, but with the shrapnel still embedded, her options were limited. If she pulled it out, he'd bleed out in seconds. If she left it in, internal bleeding might kill him before the helicopter arrived. She compromised. packing more gauze around the wound site and tightening the pressure dressing. It wasn't enough, but it was all she had. The sound of rotor blades cut through the mountain air. Emily looked up to see a Black Hawk helicopter cresting the ridgeline, its door gunners scanning for threats. The sight of it made her want to weep with relief, but relief was premature. The helicopter circled twice, the pilot's voice crackling over Chun's radio. "Ground team, this is Dustoff 3-1. Landing zone is too hot. Taking small arms fire from the North Ridge. Need you to suppress those positions before we can touch down." "Copy that, Dustoff 3-1. Chun switched frequencies. "All squads, concentrate fire on the North Ridge. Light them up." The Marines who could still fight opened up with everything they had. M4 rifles barked in 3-round bursts. Someone had salvaged Morrison's damaged SO and was coaxing bursts from it despite the cracked receiver. The noise was deafening. The Black Hawk descended in a tight spiral, its rotor wash kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Emily shielded Webb's face with her body, trying to keep dirt out of his wounds. The helicopter touched down for maybe 15 seconds, just long enough for the flight medics to sprint out with a stretcher. Emily briefed them quickly and efficiently. Shrapnel to lower left abdomen, approximately 7 centimeters long, embedded at 45-degree angle. Possible iliac artery involvement. BP 80 over 50 and dropping. Pulse 120 and thready. 2 liters saline running wide open. Morphine 10 milligrams administered 30 minutes ago. The lead flight medic, a grizzled staff sergeant with eyes that had seen too much, nodded approvingly. "Good work, Doc. We'll take it from here." They loaded Webb onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency. As they carried him toward the helicopter, his hand shot out and grabbed Emily's wrist. His grip was weak but insistent. "Tell them ... He gasped. "Tell them I'm proud. Proud of all of them. Tell them yourself when you get back, sir." Emily gently extracted her wrist from his grasp. "That's in order." The ghost of that smile again. Then he was gone, disappearing into the Black Hawk's belly. The helicopter lifted off in another storm of dust and noise. Banking hard to avoid potential ground fire. Emily watched it go until it was just a speck against the bright blue sky. Then she turned to find every Marine in the platoon staring at her. Gunny broke the silence. "Carter, I owe you one. Just doing my job, Gunnery Sergeant." "Bullshit. You did a hell of a lot more than your job." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Listen up. That was some of the finest corpsman work I've ever seen." Carter treated 5 wounded Marines under fire, held a defensive position, and kept our lieutenant alive long enough for medevac. She's got more guts than half the infantry Marines I've served with. Rodriguez, despite the cuts on his face, managed a weak grin. "Doc's a badass." "Who knew?" "I knew," Mendez said from where he lay with his leg elevated. His face was pale but determined. "She told me I'd live to tell my kids about this." "Damn well better be right." "You will," Emily assured him. "But you're getting the full dose of antibiotics when we get back. And you're staying off that leg for at least 3 weeks." "Yes, ma'am." Emily helped Rodriguez load Mendez onto an improvised stretcher 2 tent poles threaded through a poncho liner. Morrison, his left shoulder wrapped in gauze and his arm in a sling, approached her. "Thanks, Doc," he said quietly. The big man from Montana wasn't much for words, but his eyes said everything. "How's the shoulder?" "Hurts like hell. But I'll live." He paused. "Heard you held the eastern slope. With a pistol." Wasn't exactly Rambo. More like terrified medic trying not to die. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being scared shitless and doing it anyway. Morrison nodded toward the slope where Emily had made her stand. 3 Taliban fighters. You held off 3 fighters by yourself. That's something. Emily didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and moved on to check the other wounded Marines. The patrol down the mountain took 4 hours. They had to move slowly, carefully, watching for signs of ambush. The Taliban had melted away after the airstrike, but that didn't mean they were gone. They could be regrouping, planning another attack, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sergeant Chun took command in Lieutenant Webb's absence. He was a good Marine, steady and smart, but Emily could see the weight of sudden responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every decision now was his. Every Marine's life was his concern. They passed through a narrow defile, where the walls rose on either side like the teeth of some great stone beast. Emily's nerves were wound tight as piano wire. This was the perfect spot for an ambush. One RPG could turn this passage into a kill zone, but nothing happened. They emerged into a wider valley, and in the distance, Emily could see the concrete barriers and guard towers of FOB, Phoenix.Home, or as close to home as this place would ever be. They reached the base as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red. The Marines manning the gate looked shocked at the platoon's conditioned blood-stained uniforms, makeshift stretchers, hollow eyes that had seen too much. A crowd gathered as they entered. Marines from other platoons, personnel from headquarters, Navy corpsmen from the aid station. Emily was immediately swarmed by the medical staff, all of them asking questions at once. How many wounded? What's the status? Do we need to prep for surgery? Emily gave a rapid brief. Mendez needed immediate transport to the main hospital at Bagram for surgery on his leg. Morrison's shoulder needed x-rays and debridement. The others could be treated here at the FOB. She helped transfer Mendez to the waiting ambulance, adjusting his 4 one last time before the doors closed. Remember what I told you. You're going to be fine. Yeah, Doc. Thanks for not letting me bleed out. Part of the job description. The ambulance pulled away, leaving Emily standing in the gathering darkness. Her adrenaline was finally wearing off, and exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her legs trembled. Her hands shook. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Corpsman Carter? A voice she didn't recognize. Emily turned to find a Navy lieutenant, commander in medical insignia, standing behind her. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the senior medical officer at FOB Phoenix. Emily had met her briefly during in-processing, but had never worked with her directly. Yes, ma'am? I need you to come with me to medical. We need to debrief, and I need to check you for injuries. I'm fine, ma'am. Just a scratch on my forearm. That wasn't a request, Corporal. Dr. Mitchell's voice was kind but firm. You've been in combat. You've got blood all over you. You need to be checked. Emily followed the doctor to the aid station, a plywood structure that smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Dr. Mitchell had her sit on an exam table and began a methodical assessment. Where's the scratch? Emily held out her left arm. A fragment had torn through her uniform sleeve and gouged a furrow in her forearm. It wasn't deep, but it was dirty. Dr. Mitchell cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it with gauze. You'll need to keep this clean and change the dressing daily. Any other injuries? No, ma'am. Headache? Ringing in your ears? Blurred vision? My ears are ringing a bit from the gunfire, but that's normal. Dr. Mitchell shone a penlight in Emily's eyes, checking her pupil response. You were in an intense firefight for nearly an hour. You treated multiple casualties under fire. You engaged enemy combatants. That's a lot for anyone, let alone a corpsman on her first deployment. I was just doing my job. Emma, so everyone keeps saying. Dr. Mitchell set down the penlight and looked at Emily with an expression that was part concern, part curiosity. Talk to me about what happened up there. Not the medical stuff, I'll get that from your reports. The other stuff. How are you handling it? Emily wanted to say she was fine, that it was all part of the job, that she'd trained for this and could handle it, but sitting in the quiet of the aid station, with Dr. Mitchell's kind eyes watching her, The walls Emily had built around her emotions began to crack. I shot someone, she heard herself say. Maybe 3 someones. I don't know if they're dead. I don't know if I care. And I don't know what that makes me. Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. It makes you human. And it makes you a Marine who did what was necessary to protect her unit. I'm a medic. I'm supposed to save lives, not take them. In an ideal world, yes. But we're not in an ideal world. We're in a war zone. Dr. Mitchell pulled up a stool and sat down so she was at eye level with Emily. Let me tell you something. I've been doing this for 15 years. 3 deployments. I've treated hundreds of wounded. And I've learned that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is protect the people who need protecting, even if that means using violence. It doesn't feel compassionate. It feels like I crossed a line I can't uncross. Maybe you did. War changes people. It forces us to do things we never thought we'd do. But that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means you're adapting to an extreme situation. Dr. Mitchell paused. How's Lieutenant Webb? Emily latched onto the chains of subject gratefully. Last I heard, he was still alive. The flight medics got him out. That's all I know. That's because of you. If you hadn't stabilized him, if you hadn't made the right calls under pressure, he'd be dead. Same with Mendez. Same with Morrison and all the others. You saved lives today, Emily. Don't forget that part. Emily wanted to believe her. Wanted to focus on the lives saved rather than the shots fired. But her mind kept returning to that moment on the eastern slope, finger on the trigger, watching through the M9 sights as a man fell. I need you to do something for me, Dr. Mitchell said. I need you to talk to the chaplain. Or the combat stress team. Or hell, talk to me. But don't bottle this up. Don't pretend it didn't affect you. That road leads to some very dark places. I'm fine, ma'am. Really, Dr. Mitchell sighed. You know what every Marine says when I ask them how they're doing? I'm fine. You know how many of them are actually fine? Maybe 10%. The rest are carrying trauma they don't know how to process. She stood and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Promise me you'll think about it. That's all I ask, I promise. Good. Now get some food in you and get some sleep. You've earned it. Emily left the aid station and headed toward the chow hall. She wasn't hungry, but she knew she needed to eat. Her body was running on empty, and tomorrow would bring another day of patrols. Another day of keeping Marines alive. The chow hall was crowded with Marines from various units. All of them eating the same mediocre food and complaining about the same things. Emily grabbed a tray and loaded it with something that might have been meatloaf. Something that definitely wasn't mashed potatoes. And a cup of coffee that tasted like diesel fuel. She found an empty corner table and sat down, trying to ignore the curious glances from other Marines. Word had obviously spread about the ambush. About Lieutenant Webb. About the corpsman who'd held the eastern slope. Mind if we sit? Emily looked up to find Rodriguez and Sergeant Chun standing with their trays. She gestured to the empty seats. Hell of a day, Rodriguez said, settling into his chair with a wince. The cuts on his face had been cleaned and bandaged, making him look like he'd lost a fight with an angry cat. Understatement of the year, Chun replied. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, but his uniform was clean and his bearing was still sharp. A leader, even when he was running on empty. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Emily pushed the not meatloaf around her tray, managing to choke down a few bites. Heard you talk to the senior medical officer, Chun said finally. Everything okay? Just a scratch. Nothing serious. That's not what I meant. Chun set down his fork and looked at her directly. Today it was a lot. For all of us. But especially for you. You're a medic. You're not supposed to be in the fight. Gunny gave me a weapon and told me to hold a position. I held it. You did more than hold it. You engaged enemy combatants. That's combat action. Chun paused. I'm putting you in for a commendation. Bronze Star, probably. Maybe higher. Emily's stomach dropped. That's not necessary, Sergeant. It absolutely is. You saved lives today. Multiple lives. Under fire. While simultaneously defending a tactical position. That's valor, Carter. I was scared out of my mind the entire time. Rodriguez laughed. So was everyone else. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you're scared and you do it anyway. Morrison said the same thing. Morrison's a smart guy, even if he doesn't talk much. Rodriguez took a sip of his coffee and grimaced. Jesus, this stuff could power a tank. Probably is powering a tank somewhere, Chun said with a slight smile. It was the first time Emily had seen him smile all day. The conversation shifted to safer topics. Rodriguez talked about a letter he'd gotten from Maria, his girlfriend back in El Paso. She was planning their wedding for when he got home. Spring ceremony, outdoor venue, mariachi band. He was clearly excited, even if he tried to play it cool. Chun talked about his daughter, who was almost 2 now and apparently trying to say Dada in the videos his wife sent. He missed her first steps, her first words. All the little moments that parents were supposed to witness. Emily listened. Grateful to think about something other than blood and bullets and the weight of the M9 in her hands. These were the real reasons they were here. Not abstract concepts like freedom or democracy, but concrete connections to the people they loved. The families waiting for them back home. After dinner, Emily dragged herself back to her barracks. The female enlisted quarters were in a separate plywood structure. Smaller than the male barracks, but with the same basic amenities, rack-stacked 3 high wall lockers. A single window with a view of concrete barriers. Only 3 other women were assigned to Phobe Phoenix. Staff Sergeant Ramirez from Logistics, who was currently at Bagram for a supply conference. Private First Class Johnson, an intelligence analyst who worked night shifts and was rarely around. And Lance Corporal Ashley Freeman, a motor transport operator who'd become Emily's closest friend on the base. Freeman was sitting on her rack when Emily entered, cleaning her rifle with methodical precision. She looked up as Emily walked in. Jesus, you look like hell. Feel like it too. Emily collapsed onto her own rack, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Heard about the ambush. Is it true you held off Taliban fighters by yourself? Word travels fast. This is a military base. Gossip moves at the speed of light. Freeman set down her cleaning rod. Seriously though, are you okay? Emily closed her eyes. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough. Freeman was quiet for a moment. Webb's going to make it, by the way. Just got word from Bagram. He's in surgery now, but the docs are optimistic. Relief flooded through Emily's chest. He's alive? Alive and bitching about missing the rest of the deployment, apparently. They're probably going to send him to Germany for recovery, then stateside. Good. That's good. Freeman returned to cleaning her rifle. The familiar sound of metal on metal, the smell of gun oil, created a strange sort of comfort. Normal sounds in an abnormal place. Emily lay on her rack, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. The ambush, the casualties. The moment when Gunny had handed her that N9 and everything had changed. She thought about her conversation with Dr. Mitchell, about talking to someone, getting help, not bottling up the trauma. But what would she even say? How could she explain the contradiction of being a healer who'd taken lives? How could she reconcile the oath she'd taken to preserve life with the necessity of combat? Her thoughts spiraled, each question leading to another, until exhaustion finally pulled her under into a sleep filled with the sounds of gunfire and the weight of the M9 in her trembling. Hands. Emily woke at 05:00 to the sound of the morning call to prayer echoing from the nearby village. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back: the ambush, the blood, Lieutenant Webb's gray face as they loaded him onto the medevac. She sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. Her forearm throbbed where the fragment had gouged it. Her muscles ached from the tension of combat, and the 4-hour patrol down the mountain. Freeman was already up, lacing her boots. "Morning, sunshine. You look slightly less like death." "Gee, thanks. That's what friends are for." Freeman grabbed her cover and headed for the door. "PT in 15. Try not to be late." Gunny's already in a mood. Emily dragged herself through morning routine. Wash face in cold water. The heater had broken weeks ago, and nobody had fixed it yet. Brush teeth. Pull hair back into a tight bun that would stay secure under her cover. Uniform, boots, out the door. Physical training was normally conducted by platoon. But with Lieutenant Webb gone and half of Second Platoon recovering from wounds, the remaining Marines had been folded into other groups for the morning workout. Emily found herself running alongside Marines from First Platoon, none of whom she knew well. They kept glancing at her sideways, clearly wanting to ask about yesterday, but not quite willing to break the silence of the early morning run. 3 miles through the FOB perimeter, the mountains looming in the distance, the sun just starting to paint the sky pink and gold. Emily's legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she pushed through. Pain was temporary. Quitting was permanent. After the run came calisthenics. Push-ups until her arms trembled. Sit-ups until her core felt like it would tear. Burpees that made her want to die. The physical exhaustion was almost a relief. It kept her mind from dwelling on yesterday, from replaying that moment on the eastern slope over and over. Breakfast was the usual powdered eggs and cardboard toast. Emily forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need the calories even if her stomach protested. She was halfway through her coffee when Gunnery Hatcher approached her table. "Carter, need you at the talk in 10. The Tactical Operations Center." Emily's stomach tightened. "What's this about, Gunnery Sergeant?" "Debrief. Command wants to hear what happened yesterday. And since you were in the thick of it, they want to hear from you." Emily followed Gunny to the TOC, a reinforced concrete building in the center of the FOB. The walls were covered with maps, radio equipment, and computer screens showing feeds from surveillance drones. Major William Bradford, the battalion operations officer, sat at the head of a conference table. He was a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair. Beside him sat Captain Jennifer Torres, the company commander, and a Navy commander Emily didn't recognize. "Corporal Carter, please sit." Major Bradford gestured to a chair across from him. "This is Commander Hayes from Naval Special Warfare. He's here to ask you some questions about yesterday's engagement." Naval Special Warfare? What did SEALs want with a combat medic? Commander Hayes was a compact man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the field. His eyes were kind but intense. "Corporal, I've read the after-action reports. I've talked to Gunnery Sergeant Hatcher and Sergeant Chen, but I want to hear it from you. In your own words, what happened on that mountain?" Emily took a breath and began. She described the patrol, the ambush, the casualties. She detailed her treatment of Lieutenant Webb and the others. She explained, with clinical precision, how Gunny had given her the M9 and ordered her to hold the eastern slope. "And you engaged enemy combatants?" Commander Hayes asked. "Yes, sir. 3 fighters attempting to flank our position." "How many rounds did you fire?" 15 from the initial magazine. Another 12 from Lieutenant Webb's reserve ammunition. 27 total. "And you scored hits?" "At least 3 that I could confirm. Maybe more." Commander Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Corporal, you're aware that corpsmen are non-combatants under the Geneva Conventions?" That engaging in offensive combat operations technically violates your protected status? Emily's heart sank. This wasn't a debrief. This was an investigation. They were questioning whether she'd violated the rules of war. With respect, sir, I was defending my position and my Marines. The fighters on the eastern slope were attempting to flank us. If they'd succeeded, we would have been surrounded. Everyone would have died. I'm not criticizing your actions, Corporal. I'm explaining the legal reality. Commander Hayes pulled out a folder and opened it. However, there's a provision in military law for self-defense and defense of others. Given the circumstances, your actions were justified. In fact, they were exemplary. The tension in Emily's shoulders eased slightly. Major Bradford spoke up. Corporal Carter, we're recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device. Your actions under fire demonstrated extraordinary courage. You saved multiple lives while simultaneously defending a critical position. I was just doing my job, sir. Your job is to provide medical care. You went well beyond that. Captain Torres smiled. You should be proud, Carter. Not many people could do what you did. But Emily didn't feel proud. She felt hollowed out, like something essential had been carved away and replaced with scar tissue. Commander Hayes closed his folder. One more question, Corporal. If you found yourself in a similar situation again, would you do the same thing? Emily thought about Rodriguez and Mendez. About Lieutenant Webb, who was alive right now because she'd kept him breathing long enough for medevac. About all the Marines she'd come to think of as family. Yes, sir. Without hesitation. Good answer. Commander Hayes stood and extended his hand. Thank you for your service, Corporal. The Navy's lucky to have you. The meeting concluded and Emily was dismissed. She walked out of the talk in a daze, blinking in the bright sunlight. Gunny was waiting for her outside. How'd it go? Bronze Star, maybe. They're putting me in for it. Damn right they are. Gunny fell into step beside her as they walked toward the aid station. You know what this means, right? That I'll have a medal I don't want for doing something I wish I'd never had to do? Gunny stopped walking and turned to face her. It means you're a combat veteran now. It means you've been tested and you didn't break. It means the Marines in this platoon know they can trust you with their lives. He paused. It also means you're going to carry this with you. What happened up there? The decisions you made. That's the price of leadership, Carter. And whether you like it or not, you're a leader now. I'm a corpsman, Gunny. You're both. Get used to it. They reached the aid station, where Emily was scheduled for a shift, treating the usual complaints: stomach bugs, blisters, a possible case of heat exhaustion. Normal problems. Boring problems. Problems that didn't involve arterial bleeding or shrapnel, or the weight of a pistol in her hands. She threw herself into the work, grateful for the distraction. Over the next few days, life at Phobe Phoenix returned to a rhythm that approximated normal. Patrols went out. Patrols came back. The chow hall served terrible food. Marines complained about the heat, the dust, the boredom. Second Platoon was down to 27 Marines, 13 either wounded or killed in the ambush. Command had assigned First Lieutenant David Park to take over for Webb. Park was young, maybe 25, with the intense eagerness of someone trying to prove himself. Emily didn't trust him yet, but she figured time would tell. On the fourth day after the ambush, Emily was in the aid station, inventorying medical supplies when Sergeant Chen appeared in the doorway. Got a minute, Doc? Sure. What's up? Chen stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His expression was serious. We got word about Mendez. He's going to lose the leg. Emily's chest tightened. She'd known it was a possibility. The damage had been severe, but she'd hoped. How's he taking it? About as well as can be expected. He's at Walter Reed now. They're fitting him for a prosthetic. Chun paused. He sent a message. Asked me to tell you that he's going to tell his kids about this someday. Just like you said. Emily felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. He's a good Marine. The best. And he's alive because of you. Chun handed her a piece of paper. This is the email address for his parents. They wanted to reach out, thank you personally. You don't have to respond if you don't want to, but I think it might help. For all of you. After Chun left, Emily stared at the email address for a long time. What would she say to Mendez's parents? Your son lost his leg, but hey, at least he's alive? But maybe that was enough. Maybe survival was its own victory, even with the scars. She tucked the paper into her pocket and went back to counting gauze pads and tourniquets, preparing for the next time someone would need her skills. The next moment when she'd have to make life or death decisions with seconds to spare. 3 weeks after the ambush, Second Platoon conducted its first major operation under Lieutenant Park's command. The objective was a compound in the village of Danda, suspected of being a Taliban weapons cache. Intelligence suggested the compound belonged to a local commander named Mullah Ghaffar, a man responsible for coordinating attacks throughout the valley. Emily felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach as the platoon prepared to move out. She'd been on dozens of patrols since the ambush, but each one felt like walking a tightrope. The memory of that day lived in her bones, now the crack of gunfire, the smell of blood, the weight of decisions that could never be unmade. Doc, you good? Rodriguez appeared beside her, checking the straps on his body armor. Yeah, you? Living the dream. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. None of them were the same after the ambush. They all carried it differently, but they all carried it. The patrol set out at dawn, moving through the valley in tactical formation. Emily was positioned in the middle of the column, her aid bag fully stocked, her sidearm no longer Gunny's M9, but her own issue weapon holstered on her hip. Lieutenant Park moved with nervous energy, constantly checking his map, adjusting their route, second-guessing decisions. He was competent enough, Emily supposed, but he lacked Webb's calm confidence. The Marines felt it too. They followed orders, but without the trust that came from serving under a leader who'd proven himself. The village of Danda appeared as a collection of mud brick compounds clustered along a narrow river. Terraced fields climbed the hillsides, green with wheat despite the October season. Children played in the streets, stopping to stare as the Marines approached. Eyes sharp, Gunny called out. Something feels off. Emily felt it too. The village was too quiet. No old men sitting outside drinking tea. No women carrying water from the well. Just the children, watching with expressions too knowing for their age. The target compound was at the northern edge of the village, surrounded by a high wall. Lieutenant Park deployed the Marines in a perimeter while a fire team prepared to breach the door. That's when the shooting started, not from the compound, from the buildings around them. Windows and rooftops suddenly bristled with weapons. The Taliban had turned the entire village into an ambush. Contact. Multiple positions. Sergeant Chun's voice cut through the chaos. Emily dropped behind a low wall, her heart racing. Not again. Please, not again. But it was happening again. Bullets cracked through the air. An RPG whooshed overhead and exploded against a building, showering the street with debris. Marines returned fire, their M4s barking in controlled bursts. Corpsman up! The call came from the western position. Emily ran, keeping low, zigzagging to make herself a harder target. She found Private First Class Tyler Washington clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. She dropped beside him, her hands already assessing the wound. Gunshot. Entry wound in the right flank, no exit wound. The bullet was still inside him. You're going to be okay, Emily said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She cut away his uniform, exposing the wound. Clean entry, minimal external bleeding, but that didn't mean much. Internal damage could be catastrophic. She packed the wound with gauze, established in 4-line, pumped him full of morphine and saline. All while bullets zinged overhead and explosions shook the ground. How bad? Washington asked through gritted teeth. You'll live. But you're definitely going home. Thank God I miss. My mom's cooking. Everyone misses their mom's cooking out here. Emily secured the dressing and signaled for help. 2 Marines appeared and dragged Washington to a more protected position. Corpsman up. Another call, this time from the north. Emily ran again. Found Lance Corporal James Morrison, not the saw gunner. Different Morrison, with a sucking chest wound. She recognized the distinctive sound immediately. That wet whistle of air being pulled through a hole in the lung. She tore open a chest seal from her pack and slapped it over the wound, creating an airtight barrier. The whistling stopped. Morrison's breathing eased slightly. Stay with me, Emily ordered. Focus on my voice. In and out. Slow breaths. She worked on him for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Another 4, more morphine. Constant monitoring to make sure the chest seal held and the lung didn't collapse further. The firefight raged around them. Emily heard Lieutenant Park shouting orders, his voice high and tight with stress. The Marines were holding their positions, but barely. They were outnumbered and caught in a kill zone. We need air support. Gunny bellowed into the radio. Now, but air support took time. Time they might not have. Emily finished stabilizing Morrison and looked around for the next casualty. That's when she saw him, a Taliban fighter on a rooftop, maybe 50 meters away, leveling an AK-47 directly at a cluster of Marines who hadn't seen him yet. Without thinking, Emily drew her sidearm and fired. 3 shots sent her mass. The fighter dropped. She holstered the weapon and moved on, looking for the next wounded Marine. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that she'd just killed someone. Again. But she couldn't afford to listen to that voice. Not now. There would be time for reflection later. For guilt and questions and moral uncertainty. Right now, Marines needed her. The battle lasted another hour before the Taliban fighters melted away, disappearing into the labyrinth of buildings and alleys. 2 FA-18s had finally arrived, screaming overhead, their presence enough to break the enemy's resolve. In the aftermath, Emily treated 7 more wounded. None as serious as Washington or Morrison, but all requiring care. Burns from an RPG blast. Lacerations from flying debris. A broken arm from a Marine who'd taken cover behind a wall that promptly collapsed on him. Lieutenant Park approached as she was finishing with the broken arm. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Casualties? He asked. 2 urgent medevacs. 7 stable walking wounded. No KIAs. Emily paused. We got lucky, sir. That wasn't luck. That was good training, good Marines. But Park's voice lacked conviction. He looked shell-shocked, overwhelmed by the violence of his first real engagement. Gunny appeared, his expression grim. Sir, we need to talk about extraction. The village is hostile. We can't stay here. The medevac helicopters arrived within 30 minutes. Emily coordinated the evacuation with practiced efficiency, ensuring Washington and Morrison were stabilized for transport. As the Black Hawks lifted off, she watched them disappear into the bright Afghan sky and felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief that her Marines would get proper care. Dread about what came next. The patrol back to Phobe Phoenix was tense and silent. Every alley could hide an ambush. Every rooftop could conceal a sniper. But they made it without further contact, reaching the base as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Emily went through the motions debrief, equipment check, medical documentation. But something had shifted inside her. The second ambush had confirmed what she'd been afraid to acknowledge. This wasn't going to stop. The violence, the casualties, the impossible choices. This was her reality for the next 4 months. That night, she finally took Dr. Mitchell's advice and visited the chaplain, Lieutenant Commander James Novak. The Navy chaplain assigned to Phobe Phoenix was a gentle man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every confession imaginable. His office was a small plywood room decorated with religious symbols from multiple faiths: a cross, a Star of David, a crescent moon, prayer beads. "Corporal Carter," he said, gesturing to a chair. "I've been hoping you'd stop by." Emily sat, her hands clasped in her lap. "I don't really know why I'm here, sir." "That's okay. Sometimes we need to talk before we know what we need to say." Novak poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered pot. "Dr. Mitchell mentioned you might benefit from a conversation. But this is your time. Whatever you want to discuss or not discuss is entirely up to you." Emily took the coffee, grateful for something to do with her hands. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, like a dam breaking, the words came. She told him about the ambushes, about Lieutenant Webb's blood on her hands, about the Taliban fighters she'd shot, about the contradiction of being a healer who'd killed, about the nightmares that came when she closed her eyes, about the guilt that gnawed at her in quiet moments. Novak listened without interruption, his expression compassionate, but not pitying. "I keep thinking I should feel worse about it," Emily finally said. "About shooting those people. But mostly I just feel numb. Except when I wake up at 03:00 covered in sweat, seeing their faces. Then I feel everything at once." "Delayed emotional processing," Novak said gently. "It's common in combat. Your mind protects you during the crisis, then the emotions catch up later. It doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. But I'm supposed to be a medic. First, do no harm. I took an oath. You took several oaths. One to preserve life. Another to support and defend. Sometimes those oaths conflict." Novak leaned forward. "Emily, can I ask you something? If you hadn't fired those shots, what would have happened? Marines would have died. Your Marines. People you've trained with, lived with, cared for. People who depend on you." He paused. "You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. You chose to protect the people who needed protecting. That's not a violation of your oath. That's the truest expression of it." Emily felt tears building behind her eyes. "It doesn't feel true. It feels like I failed. Like I became something I never wanted to be. War changes us. It forces us to discover parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. Sometimes those parts are ugly. Sometimes they're heroic. Usually they're both." Novak set down his coffee. "The question isn't whether you've changed. It's whether you can live with who you've become. Can I? That's for you to answer. But I'll tell you what I tell every service member who sits in that chair. You are more than the worst thing you've ever done. You are more than your trauma. You are more than this war." He smiled sadly. "And when you go home, you'll need to remember that. You'll need to rebuild yourself into someone who can exist in a world without gunfire and bloodshed. That's the real challenge." Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "How do I do that?" "One day at a time. One conversation at a time. One honest moment at a time." Novak stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. "And by accepting that healing isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days. Days when you feel strong and days when you can barely get out of bed. That's okay. That's normal. Thank you, sir. My door is always open, Emily. Remember that." Emily left the chaplain's office feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Not healed, she understood now that healing would take years, maybe a lifetime. But for the first time since the first ambush, she felt like maybe she could survive this. Maybe she could carry these scars without being destroyed by them. Over the following months, Second Platoon conducted dozens more operations. Some were quiet patrols through cooperative villages. Others erupted into firefights that left Emily's hands covered in blood and her mind reeling. She treated 37 casualties before her deployment ended. Some died despite her best efforts. Most lived. She learned to accept both outcomes, to make peace with the limits of her skills and the randomness of combat. She also learned to be a leader. The Marines looked to her not just for medical care, but for steadiness under fire, for calm in chaos. She became the person Gunny Hatcher had seen in her that day on the mountain, someone who could be trusted with lives, who could make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. Lieutenant Park gradually found his footing, growing from an uncertain officer into a capable commander. The Marines learned to trust him. Emily learned to trust him too. Rodriguez got his wedding photos from Maria. They decided not to wait. Got married at a courthouse in El Paso with Rodriguez on Skype from Afghanistan. Both of them crying and laughing at the absurdity and beauty of it. Mendez sent updates from Walter Reed. He was learning to walk with his prosthetic, planning to go to college on the GI Bill, thinking about becoming a physical therapist to help other wounded veterans. Emily wrote back regularly, encouraging him, proud of his resilience. Lieutenant Webb recovered fully and returned to active duty. He sent a letter to Second Platoon, thanking them for saving his life. Particularly, the badass corpsman who refused to let me die on that mountain. Emily kept that letter in her foot locker. Morrison saw Gunner Morrison re-enlisted, despite his shoulder injury. He sent Emily a bottle of Montana whiskey with a note, "For when you get home. You earned it." In March, 7 months after arriving in Afghanistan, Emily boarded a C-130 transport plane at Bagram Airfield. She sat among her Marines, the ones who'd survived, who'd fought beside her, who'd become her family in this terrible, beautiful, impossible place. As the plane lifted off, she looked out the window at the mountains receding below. Somewhere down there were the places where she'd fought, bled, saved lives, taken lives. The places where she'd discovered what she was made of. She'd arrived in Afghanistan as Emily Carter, a girl from Cedar Rapids who dreamed of being a doctor. She was leaving as Corpsman Carter, a combat veteran who'd earned her stripes in fire and blood. Both versions would have to find a way to coexist. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rodriguez, "Reunion next month. You coming?" She smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." The nightmares still came sometimes. The guilt hadn't disappeared, but she'd learned to carry it differently, to channel it into purpose. Every veteran she treated, every life she saved, was a way of honoring what she'd been through, what they'd all been through. She thought about Chief Blackwell's words from a lifetime ago. "That's when you'll find out what you're really made of." She'd found out. She was made of scar tissue and determination, trauma and resilience, grief and hope. She was made of all the contradictions that combat had carved into her soul. And somehow she'd survived, not unchanged, not unbroken, but still standing, still fighting, still healing. That would have to be enough. The reunion took place at a beachfront bar in Oceanside, California, not far from Camp Pendleton. Emily arrived early, nervous in a way she hadn't been since medical school boards. 5 years felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Rodriguez was the first to spot her. He looked different, older, softer around the middle, with Maria at his side and a toddler on his hip. "Doc, holy shit, you made it." The embraces came fast. Chun, now working as a civil engineer in San Francisco, his daughter nearly 7 and talking nonstop. Morrison, surprisingly talkative after beers, running a veterans outdoor program in Montana. Freeman, still in the Corps, now a staff sergeant training the next generation of motor transport operators. And Gunny Hatcher, retired now, with more gray in his hair, but the same sharp eyes that had seen through her fear all those years ago. "Heard you finished medical school," Gunny said, raising his beer. "Dr. Carter has a nice ring to it." Wouldn't have happened without all of you, Emily replied honestly. As the evening wore on and the stories flowed, some funny, some painful, all true, Emily felt something shift inside her chest. These people knew her in a way no one else could. They'd seen her at her worst and her best. They'd trusted her with their lives, and she'd trusted them with hers. Lieutenant Park showed up late, now a captain with his own company. He pulled Emily aside, his expression serious. I never properly thanked you. For that day in Danda, you saved Morrison while I was freezing up. I've thought about that a lot over the years. You found your footing, sir. That's what mattered. Maybe, but I learned something watching you. Real leadership isn't about never being afraid. It's about functioning despite the fear. You taught me that. Near midnight, as the group began to disperse, Emily found herself standing on the beach with Gunny, watching waves crash in the darkness. You doing okay, Carter? He asked, really okay? She considered lying, defaulting to the old, I'm fine. But this was Gunny. He deserved the truth. Some days are harder than others. The nightmares come less often now. I see a therapist. I work with veterans at the VA, which helps feeling like I'm still serving, still making a difference. She paused. I'm not the same person who left Iowa, but I think I'm okay with who I've become. Good. That's good. Gunny was quiet for a moment. You know what I remember most about that first ambush? It's not the firefight or the casualties. It's watching you sprint across open ground to reach Rodriguez and Mendez. No hesitation. Just pure courage. That wasn't courage. That was terror and training. Same thing, usually. He turned to face her. You saved 17 lives during that deployment. I counted. 17 Marines who came home because of you. That's your legacy, Emily. Not the shots you fired. Not the people you couldn't save. The ones who lived. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for that, Gunny. I needed to hear it. Anytime, Doc, anytime. As she drove home that night, Emily thought about the long road from that mountain in Afghanistan to this moment. The pain, the growth, the transformation. She thought about the girl who'd signed up believing war was about big ideas, freedom, duty, honor. She'd learned it was about something simpler and more profound. The person next to you in the darkness, trusting you to bring them home. She pulled into her apartment complex and sat in the car for a moment, looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Dr. Emily Carter. Combat veteran. Healer and fighter. Teacher and student. Broken and whole. All of it true. All of it her. Tomorrow she'd return to the VA, where a waiting room full of veterans needed someone who understood. Someone who'd been there. Someone who knew that survival wasn't about being unchanged. It was about carrying your scars with purpose. She was ready. Thank you for joining me through this powerful 50,000-word journey into the life of a combat medic. Emily Carter's story represents the thousands of real medical personnel who serve in impossible conditions, making split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices made by medical professionals in combat, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these deeply researched, novel-length narratives that take you inside authentic human experiences. Like this video if Emily's journey moved you, and share it with someone who appreciates stories of courage, transformation, and the true cost of service. These epic tales take weeks to research and craft, and your support makes them possible. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Have you served? Do you know a combat medic? How did this story impact you? Remember, behind every veteran is a story of sacrifice, resilience, and the long road home. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.